Today we're chatting with Justice Minister Christlyn Moore, an attorney at law for some over 16 years. We're going to find out something different about the Ministry of Justice and how the hardworking minister gets by her day-to-day duties. Let's welcome Minister Christlyn Moore.
Thank you.
Minister, let's talk about the Ministry of Justice. What is the original idea behind the creation of the Ministry of Justice?
Well, the Ministry of Justice, as you know, would have taken various components from other ministries. The idea was to concentrate the provision of services for criminal justice under one roof. Prior to the creation of the ministry, some of these strands existed under the auspices of the Honorable Attorney General, some existed under the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and some even under People and Social Development. So for the first time, there has been a harmonization of the process, and that all strands and strings related to the administration of criminal justice is now housed under one roof here at the Ministry of Justice.
Since it came on board, really, a lot of people seem to think the Ministry of Justice is there for, if, for example, something happens, I need justice, I need Minister Moore. That's not really why the ministry was there.
No. Although I can't blame members of the public, because if you have a Minister of Justice and you need justice, and who else would you turn to? But really the ministry concentrates on the administration of criminal justice. Our responsibilities are limited to the prison, the Forensic Science Center, the Criminal Injuries Appeal Board, and the Legal Aid Authority. So that we have very limited jurisdiction, although that jurisdiction touches and concerns almost all important aspects of criminal justice administration.
Now, Minister, before we get into some of the bigger issues like re-engineering the criminal justice system and all of the bigger things that you do, the actual putting together of legislation, etc., let's talk a bit about yourself. You've come into we call it the limelight, so to speak, as Minister of Justice. How was the transition for you?
The transition curve was a bit steep. However, the staff of the ministry were very supportive, in particular the PS. But it was quite a change, transitioning from private practice into public life. While the hours are not inconsistent with those I've kept before, certainly the processes and procedures were vastly different, and that took some getting used to. Ultimately, I would like to think I've come out on the other side of it, none the worse for wear. And I'm very excited to be a part of the forefront of change.
A lot of viewers may wonder, what's the day like for the Justice Minister? How does your day begin and possibly end?
Oh dear. Well, a typical day would start at 4:30 with some light reading and then gym for 2 hours. I would get to the office by about 7:30, 9, and I would typically have between 3 to 5 meetings on an average day. That would also be interspersed with proofreading documents, helping to chart and develop policy, meeting with stakeholders, also members of staff, meetings out of the office, and this is quite apart from those agenda items that are fixed. For example, cabinet, various other committees, and those things I have no control over. The day would normally end at around 11, and we'll start it all again at 4.
Now, I know that another first for you is that of being in the Senate.
Yes.
How do you balance ministerial responsibility versus that in the Senate?
Well, the Senate is quite demanding, particularly for me, with regard to matters that fall either within my remit or have some bearing on my prior expertise, which is what I would want to bring to bear in the Senate. So it is quite demanding. But again, I see it as a continuum, so I'm not really able to divorce the senatorial aspect from the ministry aspect, but it does add another layer of responsibility, and it does pose some challenges for the division of time.
We've heard you debate in Parliament. I think maybe a couple days or weeks into your appointment, you were in the Senate giving, I think, a spirited contribution. Yes. How was that for you, your maiden speech?
I have a long history of public speaking. In fact, I think I had my first public appearance at age 4. So that public speaking is something that does not generally intimidate me. However, the Senate was a brand new forum, and so it was a little nervous. I was a little nervous at first. However, the subject matter is always what excites me, and it's normally what prompts most persons who speak in public to speak well and to speak from their heart. And in that particular instance, it was a subject matter with which I was familiar and with which I held a particularly strong view that had been arrived at over years. So that made it comfortable. It also helped to be among peers. Quite a number of the senators I've worked with before. A few of them I've done my degree with. So that brought a level of comfort to otherwise unfamiliar surroundings.
Do you feel intimidated as a woman in a man's political arena, the Senate, the ministry, government?
Not at all. You know, coming from the legal profession, which is dominated by women, I've never really felt that in terms of the practice of my profession, and I'm a minority. In addition to which, I come from a hugely matriarchal family. So that there's never been a question in my mind as to a woman's place in the world. Although the political arena is different for me, one of the ways that it is not different is because I am a woman. I don't see that as a relevant consideration at all.
Did you see yourself getting into the government 5 years ago?
No, I did not.
So that coming on the scene, is it anything close to what you would probably imagine 5 years down?
Well, what I would say is that I have developed a genuine respect and admiration for all politicians, regardless of your political bias. Politicians work hard, regardless of who is in government. Government ministers work hard. The days are long, the praise is small, the salary is average, and most, if not all, persons do this job out of love of country. And that is the new perspective that I've gained having accepted this position.
We're chatting with the Justice Minister, Christlyn Moore. When we come back, we get into some of the work of her ministry and some of what they have already achieved. Stay with us. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with the Justice Minister, Christlyn Moore, Tobagonian-born attorney at law, who has continued to assist the People's Partnership government in attaining its manifesto promise of its 7 interconnected pillars of sustainable development. Welcome back, Minister.
Thank you.
Let's talk about some of the work being done by your ministry. We'll start with the legislative agenda per se.
Certainly. As you know, the legislative agenda was well on its way when I assumed this office. One of the major pieces of our legislative agenda would surround, of course, the Administration of Justice Preliminary Inquiries Act. As you know, that had been set for proclamation in January, and that proclamation date has been delayed to August, so that we are working assiduously towards meeting that date and bringing our stakeholders to one common position of readiness. But as we go forward, we need to consider other bits of legislation that will support that act, which really is one of our pillars. And we have concentrated in two areas when we're speaking about legislation to support that act. One is we've developed a comprehensive jury policy, which is currently before the LRC for drafting. The second one is a policy on bail. Now, if I could start with the jury policy. The jury policy is meant to widen the pool of jurors in support of one of our main pieces of legislation. It is meant to create a greater level of security for jurors who are asked to serve. It is meant as well to support the civic responsibility of service by providing more protection against employers who may be a bit disconcerted by long jury trials.
Allow me to segue, Minister, this time. You've mentioned the issue of the prisons being one of your responsibilities, yes. And you've gone through the YTC. Coming into this ministry, I'm sure you've had a chance to visit some of these facilities. What are your views on them?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have good news. The prison system is old, the prison plant is old, and that has provided some challenges. In addition to which, it has been allowed over the years to perhaps become degraded to an extent. A lot of it cannot be repaired. Now, the population, or there are elements of the population, or there are voices who postulate the view that if you have criminals, you ought not to be concerned about how they are housed, right, and the conditions under which they are housed, because after all, these people have run afoul of society's basic norms, and in quite a few instances have caused serious havoc and have broken lives and families. What we lose sight of, in my respectful view, is this: prisoners don't guard themselves. So that if we have poor prison conditions, two groups of people are affected: the prisoners and the officers charged with the responsibility of guarding them. So by creating or enforcing or allowing poor prison conditions for prisoners, we create and allow poor working conditions for officers.
Minister, you've touched on a very interesting topic, and that is the humanity that exists with the prisoners. Having said that, what plans do you have for persons who have served their time and are now reintegrated into society?
Well, I would like us to start a little before that, because serving time does not mean that you necessarily reintegrate. Those are two disparate and separate movements. What you may find is that somebody has served his time, he has paid his debt to society, but society insists on a larger debt. So this person may be ostracized, this person may be victimized, or there may be no place in society for him or her. There may be no receiving agency, no receiving community, because all the ties have been broken, either because of the time this person has spent in prison or because of the nature of the crime. Society may have rejected this person. So that serving time does not equal integration. What we have is, first of all, a pre-release center. This is now at the Eastern Regional Correctional Center, where we prepare inmates for release. We start deinstitutionalizing them, as it were, preparing them for living in open spaces, interacting with persons in a social or in a more social way, and so hope to lessen the shock of the transition. NGO partners have halfway house facilities for persons who don't have anywhere to go, which also assists in this process and takes it a step further by providing perhaps more training and opportunities for employment, so that there's a soft landing.
Minister, before we move away from the issue of the prisons, because we have so much to touch on, the issue of the prison facilities, I know that recently you've made some announcement about Carrera, for example.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about those plans for Carrera and the others.
All right. Well, Carrera, as you know, is an old penal facility. In fact, it perhaps is one of the last prison colonies in the world. The day of the prison colony, the penal island, has come and gone. But quite apart from that, there is a reason why prison colonies all over the world are closing. They are unanimously expensive to maintain. Carrera is no different. Carrera has no system of running water, so all water must be trucked into the island. It costs us about $20,000 a week, simply to keep the island in potable water. Electricity on the island is generated, by generator. The water that is used for washing and so on is pumped from the ocean up to the island. The island is suffering from massive erosion because it is a small island. There is no room to expand the facility. The entire island is covered by the prison. The island is not conducive towards maintaining social relationships between inmates and their families because there is no ferry to Carrera Island. The island is a secure facility, so in order to visit the island, the inmates really have to leave so that their relatives could visit them on the mainland. It also poses a problem to provide education and training. Because the passage to the island is once in the morning and once in the evening, a trainer has to be prepared to spend the day at Carrera. It is a disincentive, therefore, to teaching. So that in the round, Carrera is an impractical facility. It is an expensive facility and it is an impractical facility. What I can say in Carrera's favor is that it's beautiful, so that it is perhaps conducive to reflection. But that is only one element of corrective therapy. And I dare say it can be reproduced elsewhere.
All right. The Prime Minister only recently announced plans of a new initiative, the cell phone grabbers and jammers.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about that.
The technology is developing at such a pace now that it is always a challenge for security agencies across the world to keep up. The prison commissioner himself said in an interview about a week ago that the greatest challenge to security in the nation's prisons is the proliferation of cell phones. Cell phones are a problem for several reasons. There is, and this is the information coming from the Commissioner of Prisons, there is the ability with the possession of a cell phone to continue to run your illicit organization from inside the prison. And whatever is the nature of that organization, to issue directives to operatives on the outside to perhaps do harm to persons, including prison officers. So that this is something that we cannot entertain. Also, the use of cell phones in prisons affords an opportunity for one prisoner to rent a cell phone to another. So it creates another layer of illegal traffic within the prison. It is a security problem. It has to be ended. So that the Honorable Prime Minister would have announced the intention to use current technology to detect these cell phones and SIM cards and related devices, and to put an end to that traffic.
Stay with us. When we come back, we touch on some more achievements of the Justice Ministry, including the Forensic Center. We'll also talk about the deoxyribonucleic acid bill. We'll be back. Welcome back. We're chatting with Senator Christlyn Moore, the Justice Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. In this segment, we want to focus on the construction of the new court system. Here, several plans on the agenda, as well as the deoxyribonucleic acid bill as it pertains to the forensic center. Welcome back, Minister.
Thank you.
Minister, there are plans to construct new courts in this country to help in the alleviation of transportation. There have been lots of conversations of things that hold back the administration of justice. Yes. Let me first ask, you've practiced for very many years, so surely you've had a first-hand experience of some of those things. Yes. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, there is no doubt that the court plant in Trinidad and Tobago is inadequate. It is particularly acute at the magisterial level because those courts are small, quite often, if not across the board. These buildings were not originally intended as courts. The magistracy is largely a tenant of existing buildings. And as you go outwards from the city centers, you realize how inadequate the plant is. I think we've all seen the Roxborough Magistrates Court, which is a little frightening. It must be for litigants as well as practitioners, and not to mention magistrates. The rural courts tend to be very, very small. The other challenge that the courts have is that some of them have not been renovated in quite a while, and the population around the courts, their catchment area, has grown exponentially. So there is literally no room to house litigants. So there is a need for plant that is purpose-built. And when I say purpose-built, I mean this. We are now at this stage where we know enough to know that we need to have zones that do not intersect. So we know that there ought to be a pathway for judges, let's say, a pathway for the police, a pathway for prisoners, a pathway for witnesses, a pathway for children. We know that these are matters that can be solved by engineering. So we have an opportunity to do it right.
We're chatting with Justice Minister, Senator Christlyn Moore. Stay with us. When we come back, our final segment focuses on the future of the Justice Ministry. Welcome back. We're chatting with Justice Minister Christlyn Moore at Tower C at the International Waterfront, where her ministry is housed. Madam Minister, we want to wrap this interview, but not before finding out some of what are your plans for the coming year in the Justice Ministry. But more so, there are several bodies under your ministry. Let's talk about them and what plans you have going forward.
All right. Well, the bodies under the ministry include the Police Complaints Authority. They really receive all complaints from members of the public who have had an adverse interaction with the police. They investigate those offenses. We have under our remit the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board, and they are charged with the responsibility of dispensing compensation to a maximum of $25,000 to victims of crime, whether or not the crime has been solved, whether or not someone has been arrested or charged. And finally, we have the Legal Aid and Advisory Authority. They provide quality legal advice and legal representations to persons who qualify by way of income for that type of support. They also provide a 24-hour on-call service to anyone who has been arrested for murder and any minor who has been arrested. So those agencies really complement the work of the Ministry of Justice.
We're chatting with the Justice Minister, Senator Christlyn Moore. As we prepare to come to an end to this interview, I must ask you, for your closing comments, what would you like to tell our listeners and viewers?
The criminal justice system has always been with us, and it intersects with our lives much more than we may appreciate. The criminal justice system ought to work. It ought to work well. It ought to work quickly, because we don't always have control over when and how, as citizens, we intersect with the system. That is why it is imperative that it work as a well-oiled machine. We want to assure the citizens that the Ministry of Justice is working assiduously to ensure that whenever citizenry interact or intersect with the criminal justice system, that they are convinced of the system's fairness and of the system's efficiency. That is our goal.
I want to thank you for joining with us, Madam Minister. It's a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.
We've been chatting with the Justice Minister, Senator Christlyn Moore, a hard-working attorney at law, who's now this country's Justice Minister. I'm Larry Lumsden. Thank you for joining us.